back in the day before Pope Francis was elected Pope. Obviously, he was known as Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio. And on the eve of the papal conclave, he gave this speech, this really short speech, where he talked about basically the essential nature of the church. And without going into a whole lot of detail, he was talking about how the church more or less was inherently missionary, right? So the church doesn't just have a mission, the church actually is a mission. And more to the point, he talked about how if the church doesn't habitually live out of its essential mission, then in a certain sense it kind of dies, right? So it's kind of reminiscent of this really great quote by St. Jose Maria Escriva, the founder of Opus Dei, where he basically says that in terms of the spiritual life, you're either advancing or you're falling back. So there's no kind of neutrality when it comes to the spiritual life. Again, you're either advancing or you're actually falling back. So as it applies to the mission of the church, whether we're talking about the universal church or the local church, either you are actively pushing the mission of the church forward on a habitual and regular basis, or you are actually falling behind, right? And so again, Pope Francis, in the context of this particular speech, what he was basically saying was that as a church, we can't stay still. We can't remain stagnant. We can't remain neutral, because neutrality in a certain sense is an illusion. We don't live in a neutral environment. Either we're advancing the cause forward, or in fact we're actually falling back. Now, of course, that kind of begs the question, what's the essential mission of the church? And it's kind of interesting when people try to answer this question or address this particular issue, they tend to rely on anecdotal evidence, personal opinion, without realizing there's actually an objective answer. There's actually an objective answer to the question, what is the essential mission of the Holy Catholic Church? And it's actually defined in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 28, right? So it's obviously in the context of the resurrection. The Lord comes back from the dead. He appears to his disciples. And what he says to them is, go forth and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them basically in the name of the Trinity and teaching them everything that I have commanded you, right? So that's basically the Great Commission. And it coincides with this idea of the mission of the church. But we could actually take it one step further, right? So Father James Mallon talks about this, right? So in his book, Divine Renovation, in the early part, he talks about how grammar plays a role here, right? So for those of you who don't know, before I became a lawyer, I was an English major, right? So I find this thing kind of interesting. You might find it colossally boring, right? But in any case, as you probably know, a verb is an action word, right? And if a sentence has multiple verbs, right, basically there's the key verb in the sentence, otherwise known as the finite verb. If there are other verbs, which isn't necessarily the case, but if there are, right, those other verbs are known as participles. And participles, they obviously modify the overall meaning of the sentence, but they only make sense in light of the finite verb. Boring, I know, right? But the reason I bring this up is because when you look at the Great Commission with those different verbs, right, if you identify the finite verb, the grammatical hinge of the sentence, then you know the essence of the Great Commission, and therefore you know the essential mission of the Holy Catholic Church, right? So that's why it's important. So again, you go back to the Great Commission. Go, make, baptize, and teach, right? Those are the four verbs. Go forth, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them again in the name of the Trinity, and teaching them everything I'm commanded, right? So again, go, make, baptize, and teach. One of those is the finite verb, the rest are participles. Now, what's interesting is that most people, when they're asked this particular question, right, when they're given the choice of the four verbs and they're asked which is the finite verb, right, most people, if they're not already glazing over, right, they tend to respond by saying it's baptize or teach, right? And apparently, based on studies or surveys or whatever, this is not restricted to the laity, right? Bishops and deacons and priests equally kind of make this same mistake, right? But it kind of makes sense if you think about it, why people would tend to answer baptize or teach. Because it speaks to the fact that when it comes to any sort of organizational structure, you can have the most beautiful mission statement in the world, but our values are revealed by what we do, right? So again, when it comes to the Catholic Church, like what are we good at? What do we do on a local level? We baptize and we teach, right? So we administer the sacraments, right? And on top of that, we impart information. So think about sacramental prep, whether we're talking about First Communion, Confirmation, RCIA, whatever the case may be, right? So we're really good at sacramentalizing and, again, at passing forth information with regards to the faith. The answer, though, in terms of the actual original question, what is the finite verb? The answer is make. Make disciples. Make disciples of all nations, in service of which is the going and the baptizing and the teaching. But of course, the fact that most people apparently within the church don't actually know that is problematic, because it speaks to the fact that we have a really low percentage play when it comes to achieving the mission of the church, because we don't even know what the mission of the church is, right? But again, the mission of the church is to make disciples of all nations, which begs the question, what's a disciple? It's kind of interesting. We're used to the terminology of being a student, right? But discipleship is different. So to think about it like this, right? What's the goal of being a student? The goal of being a student is to kind of know what the teacher knows. So insofar as I know well or perfectly what the teacher knows, I am a good student, right? But discipleship is different. The whole goal of discipleship is to become the rabbi, right? Not simply a head thing, but an entire being thing. To become the teacher, to become the rabbi. One of the best kind of explanations of this whole dynamic is given by the Protestant pastor Rob Bell, right? So this is kind of taken from one of his sermons, but basically he talks about kind of like the Old Testament's educational structure. So it kind of went like this. There were 3 stages of Jewish education. And so if I can recall, Beit Sefer, Beit Talmud, Beit Midrash, right? And I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, but that's because I don't speak Hebrew and gosh, I don't even speak Chinese, right? But so anyways, 3 stages, right? And the first stage, basically, Jewish boys and girls, they would memorize the Torah, first 5 books of the Old Testament, word for word. Like who says kids can't learn, right? Amazing. Memorized word for word. That said, the vast majority of kids would be sent home, right, to learn how to manage a household, or the expression came to be, learn how to ply your family trade. Go home, learn to ply your family trade. Go learn to do what your father does, whether it's being a carpenter, a fisherman, whatever the case may be. The best of that group will go on to stage 2, right? And stage 2 is now memorize the entirety of the Bible. Now, this is before New Testament times, right? But still, pretty impressive. Genesis through Malachi memorized word for word. Still, the vast majority of kids will be sent home. Go learn to ply your family trade. The best of the best will go on to stage 3. In stage 3, I mean, they're done with memorizing the Bible. Stage 3 is that they go throughout the countryside and they kind of try to pair up with different rabbis, different schools of thought. And they would ask these different rabbis, Rabbi whoever, will you take me on as your disciple? Now, again, you got to keep in mind this whole idea of what does it mean to be a disciple? It's not simply a head thing, it's a being thing, right? So in the words of Rob Bell, what he says is that when a rabbi is talking to a prospective disciple, the idea is not so much like to ask the question, is this kid smart? Because they're all brilliant. They all have the Bible memorized word for word. The real question is, can this kid do what I do? And can this kid, in fact, become me, right? And then this is where it gets kind of cool. If he thinks no, what he'll say, of course, is go home, learn to ply your family trade. But if he thinks yes, what he'll say is come follow me, right? And that should remind you of a certain phrase that you find throughout the course of the Gospels. Like that's precisely what the Lord says to his own disciples, right? And Rob Bell's point is that this gives a really important contextual detail in terms of the calling of the first disciples by Christ the Lord, right? Because a lot of times when we think about the calling of the disciples, like, you think about Jesus calling the disciples to himself, they drop everything to follow him. It seems kind of magical or mystical or otherwise known as not real. But once you situate in terms of this contextual detail with the 3 stages and come follow me and whatnot, you realize actually that it makes a whole lot of sense, right? Because what are the disciples doing when the Lord is actually calling them to himself? They are tax collecting, they are fishing, they are basically plying their family trade, right? In other words, they're not part of the intellectual elites. They probably flunked out of school after stage 1, right? And yet here is the Lord, not just a rabbi, but the preeminent rabbi. No one has ever spoken like this man. No one has ever done things like this man. He calls me to himself, in other words, to say to me, I believe that you can do what I do, and I believe that you can become me, right? So the reason why they drop everything to follow him is not because of some spell. It's not some magical, mystical thing. They drop everything because this guy sees something in us that perhaps we do not see in ourselves. And that is so compelling and is so refreshing that, yeah, I'm going to take a chance to drop everything, to turn my back on my former life, to become another Christ in this world. Okay. Now, to kind of frame the same concept using a slightly more contemporary example, one of my favorite interviews of all time was with this local Catholic school teacher named Dave Patterson, who runs this really great Catholic talk show in a certain sense, mainly through Instagram, but also on YouTube, called Yes Catholic. And so basically, I did this vocation story situation, right? So I was talking about how, I came back to the faith, how I eventually joined the seminary and became a Catholic priest, right? And, in preparation for the interview, David had asked different people on Instagram to submit their questions. And so I had a lot of questions in advance, so obviously I prepared answers and whatnot going forward to prepare for the interview. But I remember him asking me one question, which actually had not been submitted in advance, but it was one of my favorite questions. And the question was basically, what do you think is the biggest obstacle facing young men today? And for those listening in on the interview, I'm not sure what people were expecting. So maybe people were expecting, I would say, something like pornography or materialism or ego or pride or whatever, right? But instead, my reply was something like, I think young men need to believe, they need to trust that they can actually become great. In other words, like, we know there's the universal call to holiness, there's the call to sainthood. We all know that, right? But do I own in my bones this idea that that call applies to me? Now, obviously, it applies to both men and women, right? But this is just in response to that particular question. But the same principle applies here, right? We know we're called to great things. We know we're called to holiness, sainthood, however you want to frame the thing, right? And yet, we can get discouraged super easily, right? We look at our current circumstances, we look at this huge gap between who we are and the person that God has called us to be. And again, it's really easy to get deflated, right? But in those moments, I invite you to reflect back on what we're talking about today, right? To think about the Great Commission, to think about the three stages of Jewish education, to think about how the Lord says to us, as he says to his first disciples, come follow me. Within that invitation is a promise, right? I promise that I will help you to achieve this thing which you believe today to be impossible. You must, though, persevere. You must, though, trust. You must never give up, but instead trust in the call. If Jesus Christ calls you to be a saint, it must be possible. And the Lord, like, who is Christ, right? He is the one who made the heavens and the earth. His very word casts out sin. His very word transforms ordinary bread and wine into his own body and blood. And so again, when he says to us, come follow me, what he's saying to us is, I call you to be my disciple. I call you to be another Christ in this world. And so therefore, trust and believe that indeed it is possible. And may God bless you all.